Okay, sorry about the clickbait thumbnail. I was channeling my inner Scotty Kilmer. You know, at least I didn't feel like, oh, I've got 3 hours to live. Actually, I love Scotty. Scotty gave us a couple of shout outs early on in this channel's life that really gave us a big boost. So I'm like forever in his debt. Thank you, Scotty. But yeah, don't do it. I want to talk about a couple of traditional old school mechanic hacks that are both unnecessary and can lead to a lot more trouble than they're worth. So the first one, if you go back a couple of weeks ago, we did a video on engine efficiency and carbon buildup. And we were talking about intake valves and how carbon builds on the back face of the intake valve and it won't transfer heat to the incoming mixture enough to adequately vaporize fuel. So one of the time-proven techniques for decarboning the top end of an engine is to pour water down either the throttle body or the carburetor, whatever it happens to be, whatever you're working with. And the water gets in there and it basically steam cleans the inside of the motor and it breaks the carbon up on the back of the valves. That works. It has always worked, it always will work. But in the comments, more than a few people said, yeah, we do the same thing with automatic transmission fluid. You do, just pour ATF down the carburetor or the injector, the throttle body, and it'll make a ton of smoke, but it'll clean out the inside of the engine. I know, okay, no, the water and the ATF trick are two completely different things. And while the water thing works like universally, the ATF thing can get, first off, it's unnecessary today. And secondly, it can get you in a lot of trouble it can lead to a lot of trouble down the road. So the purpose of pouring the ATF and Marvel Mystery Oil, people use Marvel Mystery Oil for the same purpose. The purpose of doing that wasn't to clean carbon off the back face of the valves. It was to clean varnish off the valve stem. Right? Now, here's what you need to understand. Gasoline is formulated differently today than it was in the old days. So back when almost every vehicle used a fuel system that was vented to the atmosphere, evaporation was a problem. As it is today, if you run a carbureted car today, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You leave the car sit for 2 days and you gotta crank it to get the fuel to come back up to the carburetor. In the old days, they used to formulate the gasoline so that it wouldn't evaporate. And so there were additives in the gasoline that would cause a varnish, a heavy, gummy varnish. And any of you guys who've torn apart old engines know exactly what I'm talking about. That doesn't exist anymore. Today, when gasoline evaporates, it leaves a crusty, like powder behind. But in the old days, it would never fully evaporate. It would reduce and become this varnish. Well, that varnish, or that additive that was in gasoline to keep it from evaporating, when it was subjected to heat, like the back face of the intake valve, some of it would stick to the stem of the valve. And what would happen is, over time, it would actually stick the valve in the guide. And you would get a telltale misfire out of that. It would just be pop, 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 pop. It was constant up through the carburetor or the injector. That was from that additive, that anti-evaporative additive. The transmission fluid or Marvel Mystery Oil would break that up, and that's how you would free the top end of an engine when the valve would start to stick. Very, very common. I mean, like, you look at from the old days, you look at any engine that had, like, let's say, close to 100,000 miles on it or thereabouts. It was common. It happened to almost all of them. But that was the common fix. Now, over the last 20 years or so, 30 years, since they've done away with carburetors and atmospheric vented fuel systems, they no longer formulate gasoline like that. So gasoline doesn't form that varnish on the back of the valve and stick it. So that's why it's unnecessary. Now, if you do want to clean up, let's say, varnish or buildup that's on the top of the engine, and you decide to use like an ATF for that, your long-term effect there, if you're running anything with a catalytic converter, is that transmission fluid is going to coat the inside of the converter. And what you'll find is, especially if you got like an OBD2 deal, catalytic converter threshold below efficiency, well, do the ATF trick down the throttle body a time or two, and then within 100 miles, 200 miles, you get the check engine light, catalytic converter efficiency below threshold, because you coated the converter with transmission fluid residue. So that's something you definitely want to avoid. Now, the second thing is an old school trick that I was tempted to do myself on my own car, and I said, no, just pull the transmission. All right, so you guys know scribbles, okay? So we've been using scribbles to run back and forth to the shop now for a week, and I've put over 100 miles on it, back and forth and a little running around, and the car hits the road great. I mean, it has a lot of faults, it has a lot of issues, but it hits the road beautifully, right? Cruises 70 miles an hour on the interstate, no problem. But I've got a pesky transmission leak. So it's leaking a little bit from the front seal, it's leaking a little bit from the rear seal. And I'm getting a drip. All right. Now, there's only one proper fix for this, and that's to pull the transmission out and change the external seals. It's a pain. I hate doing this stuff, but that's the right way to fix it. Now, the old school mechanic trick from back in the day was to use brake fluid. And the ratio, the proper ratio, is a shot glass. Okay, well, that's a measuring glass, but you get the idea, right? You know, to the line. A shot glass of brake fluid for every 1 quart of ATF. So let's just say you had a transmission that held 10 quarts of ATF, you'd use 10 shots of brake fluid in there. And over the course of 25, 50 miles or thereabouts, that brake fluid would migrate its way through the transmission, it would find the seals, and it would swell the seals. It would actually make the rubber a little bit softer, and it would swell up the seals and would stop a leak. This was the ultimate used car dealer, trick, right? All right. The problem with that now is that the rubber, all right, we have to talk about, okay, let's get sidetracked for a second now, right? Automotive rubber is an interesting thing, okay? Automotive rubber, generally speaking, it's all black, right? So, the rubber that belts are made from is black, the rubber that tires are made from is black, the rubber that hoses are made from is black, the rubber that transmission seals is black, fuel lines is black. It's all black, right? It's all rubber. It's all black rubber. But they're drastically different in their composition. So they're all based on rubber. Rubber is the base element. But there are so many things that are added depending on the intended use of that rubber that make it impervious to certain things or susceptible to certain things. So like if you've ever, let's say if you've ever cleaned with gasoline and you got gasoline, let's say on a rubber tire, you'll notice that that tire will dry rot there in a very short period of time. It leaches certain chemicals out of the rubber and destroys it. That you see today, you've got a rash of bad fuel line, right? It doesn't stand up to ethanol, people say, but it's not that. It's just a bad composition of fuel line that over a short period of time, the gasoline, ethanol, gasoline, whatever it happens to be, the fuel gets to it and dries it out. It leaches out certain elements, and it cracks and it leaks. So now you have to find fuel submersible specific hose. There's a lot to this, right? But you're getting the general idea. So there are rubber parts inside of the braking system of a car. So you've got you've got inside the master cylinder, you've got the plungers, right? Inside the wheel cylinders or calipers, you've got seals, rubber seals. And these rubbers are formulated specifically to be impervious to brake fluid. Okay, now inside the transmission, you have very similar looking rubber, but it's formulated to work with the hydraulic fluid that transmission fluid is. And so when you introduce brake fluid to it and you make it swell, you know, it soften up and swell, because as rubber ages, it wants to contract. It gets hard and it wants to contract. The brake fluid on the rubber that's formulated for transmission use, well, it softens it and it makes it expand. That will seal up a leak, an external leak. So, like I says, brake fluid in the transmission, you drive, 50 miles and all your drippage is gone. But here's what you need to know. The rubber seals inside the transmission are of the same composition as the seals at either the torque converter or the tail shift. Okay, so you're stopping the leak there by softening and swelling that rubber fly. But at the same time, this is a lip seal. This is one of the seals that's inside. This fly, stop, I'm making YouTube. This seal is one of several inside the transmission that seal the hydraulic circuits and allow the pistons inside the transmission to move. Okay, so when you're softening, expanding, and the external seals, you're doing the same things to the ones that are exposed to pressure. So the transmission, the torque converter or the front pump seal, there's no pressure there, and the rear seal at the tail shift, there's no pressure there. It's just keeping the training fluid that's splashing around, keeping it inside. So yeah, you can swell those, they're not really any big deal. But these are exposed to pressure. They operate on pressure. So what happens is you throw the brake fluid in there, it seals up everything, expands it and helps it seal, but it expands these and it softens these. And within not too long of a time, and once these have been contaminated like that, they'll fail. And when they fail, your internal pressures drop, the transmission starts to slip, and it's a goodbye. So brake fluid in the transmission fluid will help seal a leak, but it will destroy the transmission. So it was a used car dealer trick. They'd get a car in and the front seal was dripping, and rather than pull the transmission and go through all of that, brake fluid, throw some brake fluid in there, it'll seal it up, and it would. But then 300 miles later, 500 miles later, the customer ended up with a dead transmission. And no warranty. You know what I mean? As is, where is. So avoid that at all possible costs. So there you go. 2 old school, time-proven things that will work, but are both unnecessary and damaging in the long run. All right? Okay, guys. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.